The last part of Paul Gauguin's life, we see him moving to the Marquesas Islands, which is just a little bit north and to the east of Tahiti. He moved out here to move himself even further from society and move even more to the primitive nature of things, if you will. And unfortunately, the Marquesas Islands, if you think of all of the symptoms of colonialism, the Marquesas Islands is probably the worst example of all of them. You have a population of over 200,000, reduced to around 4,000. Very, very harsh missionary control of the locals, that type of thing. So he kind of goes backwards from where he wanted to, if you will. But when we look at the work, again, a lot of this might have been started, if you will, in Tahiti and then maybe finished in the Marquesas, but we again return to this sense of complexity that we didn't find in the earlier periods of his work, where again, this complexity that I kind of think he brought about in himself when he was in Europe is kind of continuing as we look at this. But again, we also start to see some of these bright colors, and it is thought at this time he starts to really use the idea of complementary colors and also using warm tones and cold tones in combination. Again, if we look at that orange in combination to those greens, very, very vibrant. Here we have Nevermore, kind of an adaptation of the earlier painting we looked at that was very similar to this, but obviously taking the Edgar Allan Poe story and intertwining it now instead of the face of death. What we have is the raven as the symbol of death peeking through the window. But again, the idea of the young woman lying innocently, if you will, on the bed, almost unaware of what's occurring around her. And interestingly, we have another two people in this image in the background as well, where before it was an isolated composition. If you look at her feet, you can see an amazing amount of detail in structure. Very, very warm tone painting. Again, if we look at this and we look at his use of color towards the end of his life, this is really kind of what I think of as focus as much as anything. We have orange and red and yellow all working together to create this wonderful warm scene. The bathers, again, if you think about the history of all of the paintings that have come and gone under this title, we think of Cezanne all back through history. This is, of course, a play on that idea as well. We also have that reintroduction of the cloisonnism in the water itself. We start to see these broader packets of red and yellow reaching back into the canvas and if you will. Where do we come from? What are we and where are we going? This is the probably the most famous painting by Paul Gauguin, and it really is meant to symbolize, at least in his mind, the full structuring of everything he had learned as a painter and also as this person, this modern primitive, if you will, in Tahiti. You're supposed to read it from the right to the left, where on the right we have a small child, and as we move along the composition, one ages until we reach the end, and we have an old man on the very, very far left of the painting itself. Again, when we look at this and its complexity, this really was meant for Gauguin, at least, as the final work. But he continues to work despite that being his quote-unquote final work. It was rumored that, again, he had tried to commit suicide after painting that Where Are We Going? Tahitian Pastoral, when we look at this, we see the cloisonnism that is so famous. And in my mind, it's almost funny because if you look at the background, it almost looks like that famous piece of red fabric that we've seen so many times. In this, he's transformed it into the water, if you will, at a sunrise or sunset. But we still have that interplay with the white top that the young woman is wearing as well. We also have an inclusion of this fox or this dog character that we see in a few of his paintings. Moving along to 1898, again, we need to remember the effects of syphilis or whatever might have been wrong with him. Again, they're not 100% sure that he had syphilis, but pretty confident. As he continues, this does continue to deteriorate his health, and Whenever I think of the white horse, I always think of that as a symbol of death, and maybe perhaps this is what he was thinking of as well. When we look at this, again, very calm type of scene, he's reducing the complexity that we saw from his intermediate European period moving into the early Tahitian second period. And again, those large packets of color, large packets of green. Tahitian woman and boy. This almost looks like a European composition, a European setting, but involving Tahitian people. Again, that very, very famous pink European-style dress. What's interesting on this version, though, is you'll notice that there's a detail right below the collar, almost this fine stitching. And in previous versions where he's incorporated this dress, we don't see that as much. We don't see that detail. Again, whether or not that detail was actually there and was just removed or not, it's hard to say. Perhaps this is a different piece of clothing altogether. But again, he uses a lot of the same clothing motives throughout. Flight from 1901 is a wonderful mixture of a lot of the elements that we associate with Gauguin. Again, the Cloisonnism, but also these use of colors in a very interesting way. Again, if we think of orange and blue as complementaries, we can see that in effect here, but he's also using warm and cool tones against each other. This is as much about color in my mind as it is about the emblem. And again, flight, when you think about the ideas of flight and what it might incur within this and in the mind of a person who's slowly watching themselves decay, if you will. Again, this can be registered in my mind as a personal painting from Gauguin as much as anything. Landscape with three figures. Returning to the idea of showing the landscape with the figures being smaller aspects of it in the background. When we look at this and we look at the model again of what his house was, the Maison de Jour from the time period, these are very similar, and even it could be possible that that could be his house there in the background. Again, he's kind of reaching a point of immobility, so a lot of these are going to be very close to where he's living, where his studio actually was. Again, this is most likely a Marquesas landscape rather than something from Tahiti, but if you look at it, there's obviously a lot of similarities between the two. Marquesan landscape with horses in 1901. In 1901, his book Noa Noa is actually published, and again, when from my understanding, he didn't show a lot of interest in the publication, other than that it was finally published. When we look at this, again, very complex, but at the same time, we have this beautiful sash of purple across the middle of the painting, very much accenting the yellow color that we see very vibrantly on top of it, leading off to the floral tones of green and then to blue. Again, when we look at this, we see him interplaying with color, the purple in connection with the red flowers as much as anything. Still life with hope, the painting Hope, we'll speak about in just 1 second. Again, he did a few still lifes. This is the only one that I've really shown. Again, as he becomes more and more immobile, it becomes more difficult to journey out and paint, and we see more things that one would associate with simple still lifes and things like this. Again, when we look at it, though, he really does kind of translate over what he was doing with landscapes into the pot itself. When we look at the container for the flowers, it almost looks like a piece of architecture rather than something to hold flowers. And in that, it's even difficult to see how the flowers are sitting. If we look in the background, we can see a painting by Puvet de Shyvana. This is a French painter that Gauguin actually was an admirer of. This painting looks like a quirky little painting from the Middle Ages, but it's actually a reflection of the Franco-Prussian War and Shyvana's personal feelings about this. Again, if we look in the background, we kind of have Gauguin's version of it, very much simplified from what we see, larger color patterns. It's an interesting comparison to see what, again, the Shyvana painting and what, again, Gauguin would actually have done the same type of composition with, radically different in terms of how they're executed. In some of his last compositions, we actually see a few characters or a few repeated individuals, and this would be two of them. We have this woman who was thought to be a princess, if you will, from a tribal region close by. She's very famous, though, for her red hair. And again, when you think about the individuals that Gauguin is painting, this woman with red hair it would be quite distinct to point out. Next to her in this composition is actually a man who was thought to be her husband. This is a priest, sorcerer who actually lived in the local area as well. And next to both of them, this isn't actually Gauguin. This is a different individual that Gauguin knew that passed away a while ago. Here we see her again in Girl with a Fan, and it really is quite obvious when we look at this that Gauguin was looking at this photograph when he was actually painting this composition. In some ways, this almost looks unfinished, but that's because we have the photograph as a reference, and we can see aspects of the background. But this is a very unusual painting for Gauguin because, again, it's almost too simplistic. When we look at the background and we don't see any type of character or any type of distinctive coloration, that's a separation. Even the vibrantness in some ways has been separated from this painting. It's hard to put this into the same catalog as the images we've seen before. From 1902, Writers on the Beach, and this has always been in my mind the Gauguin version of a Degas subject matter, but again, when we look at the beautiful pink colors and the vibrancy that he's able to capture through the use of these colors on this landscape, this very much is a beautiful rendition of what you would actually feel if you were there and enjoying the heat, the little bit of heat in the summer breeze, if you will. So again, when we look at this, this is a further reminder of what Gauguin has brought to the art world and why his inclusion is so important. The last few paintings that we look at from the series as we get closer to the end of his life, again, these are almost personal paintings in my mind, showing aspects of what he would see around him. And again, it almost seems a certain amount of enjoyment, but also vibrancy within the colors themselves. Again, these last period pieces from 1902 leading forward, very much enjoyable as we look at his real mastery of the techniques that he had developed throughout his time in Tahiti, and again moving forward to his second time in Tahiti as well. Here is actually the gentleman I was speaking about earlier. This is a local sorcerer of Hivaoa, which is the island he was staying on. And again, you look at this red cloak that this gentleman is wearing. Again, this is a gentleman. He kind of has an androgyny about him, but again, this is thought to be a local medicine man or sorcerer, if you will, that type of individual. Again, we see this dog or little wolf type of creature reappearing in Gauguin's painting there, and I always wonder if in some ways towards the end of his life, if this wasn't a symbol of himself in some ways reappearing in the landscape and maybe his relationship to what's going on. We see him one more time sitting in the back window actually looking forward to us. Two women with flowered hair. Again, we look at the women, but we fall in love with the purples and the blues in the background and the lushness of the tones. And again, it really seems like he's painting at this point. It might be a little bit of a struggle, but I always find a certain amount of enjoyment in the works that we find towards the end of his career. And again, we know that in 1903 he does pass on from either complications with syphilis or he has a heart attack, but we're not 100% sure. There wasn't an extensive medical staff on the Marquesas Island at the time. We do have this last self-portrait from him, and this is actually a self-portrait that was thought to have been started by a friend of his and then essentially finished, and we can see him wearing glasses in this, and this is the only self-portrait that we do have of him with glasses, and it's thought that again with the effects of syphilis they might have damaged his eyes, or his eyesight might have been going at this time as On the right, you can see his grave, a nice tribute to the man who spent the last part of his career on these islands.